pretty much everything that's in our culture is not fit for a future that we want to live in. It's not something that we would want to leave to the generations that come after us. And yet, how do we shift it when we're inside it? And I always come back to the answer of settling into our heart mind. For me, the 3 pillars of the heart mind are gratitude, compassion, and joyful curiosity. And the joyful curiosity, that sense of, wow, this is amazing. I wonder what happens next. The not knowing. That leaf on the tree, wow, it's amazing. The ponies in the field, wow, they're amazing. The capacity to talk to you is amazing. Every podcast like this, every time anyone who listens to this begins to spread these ideas, it removes the power of the bigger narrative that only business as usual is possible and we have to keep maintaining it, because we know that's not true now. And yes, I really want to emphasize to people, the ideas are out there.
Welcome back, dear ones. We have a new epic for you here. As ever, if you love the podcast, do get in touch, join our membership, and dive deeper into one-to-one work or personal ceremony with me. You can find out more about all of that over at allthatweare.org or amisha.co.uk. This conversation feels like a good one for election week, as what has happened in the US ripples out across the world. Here we explore what's possible from this very point that we find ourselves at. My guest is Manda Scott, best known for the Boudica Dreaming series. Manda was once a veterinary surgeon and is now an award-winning novelist, smallholder, contemporary shamanic trainer, and host of the international chart-topping Accidental Gods podcast. Reading for a master's in regenerative economics at Schumacher College taught her that hospicing modernity is our most urgent task, and that it's only possible if enough of us have roadmaps showing routes through from exactly where we are towards a future that works for all life. She is co-creator of the Thrutopian Writing Masterclass, and her new novel, Any Human Power, is a Thrutopian mythopolitic thriller. In this conversation called Writing a New Story, we explore the themes of Thrutopia, vision, and human power as we speak to the question, how do we emerge into a new vision from here? We hope that this episode encourages you to explore deeper what invitations the web of life is making to you. Welcome to All That We Are, with me, your host, Amisha Tala Oak. On this show, we explore the weave between activism, the sacred, creativity, and regeneration, the spaces where our inner and outer worlds dance. From healing trauma to nature connection, to new technologies, to ancient wisdom, it's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a more beautiful future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to listen, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing and envisioning, we create the futures of our wildest dreams, and we begin to embody all that we are becoming, and all that is possible. Manda, it is a great joy to welcome you to All That We Are. Thank you for coming here and sharing your time and wisdom with us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's all very up in the air here because I let the ponies out onto the hill this morning for the first time since April, and I can see them cantering backwards and forwards out to the corner of my eye, hoping that they're being sane. So yeah.
So we begin with wild horses.
Yeah, very. Yeah. I forget how fast they can go until they've got 10 acres to go on. It's like, oh, little racehorses. Yay.
What is life for you today when I ask the question, what are the futures of your wildest dreams?
when I thought about this before, so the answer is slightly different than it has been because I've just come off recording a video with Maddie Harland of Permaculture Magazine and Rupert Reed of the Climate Majority Project. And between us, we've created a book on transformative adaptation. So we've just been talking about that. And in speaking to that, I realized that I am very invested in the concept of emergence into a new system, that we are right on the edge of what Ilya Prigogine defines as a system at maximal complexity. And he says there are two paths. It either crashes into chaos and extinction, or it emerges into a new system. And that the new system, by definition, is not visible from the old system. It's not predictable. If we can predict it, then it's not the new system. But we can take ourselves to the emergent edge of interbecoming, from which emergence into that new system is hopefully more likely than the chaos and extinction. And so I want that new system very badly. And I don't know exactly what it's going to look like because it will be grounded in everybody becoming as fully realized as it's possible to be, are moving from a trauma culture to an initiation culture, are healing our relationships with ourselves, each other, and the more than human world. And I can feel the edges of that. I can feel the wonder of it at the times when I sit still and really open into the joyful curiosity of that. It feels absolutely magical. And I remember all the time that one of my main guides came at a point when I was completely not expecting. I was lying on a table having emmet therapy, which is lovely, but isn't somewhere I expect visions. And she walked up and she said, "The world is not what you think it is." And I have to not constrain the possibilities by my imaginings. So I imagine in my wildest dreams a world where every single human being on the planet is fully realized and is fully connected to the web of life, such that everyone can ask all of the time, "What do you need of me?" and respond to the answers in real time, where everyone has that sense of being and belonging and connection and agency and a life filled with meaning. And what does it look like when 8.5 billion people have that? It feels heartbreakingly, heart-makingly, heart-explodingly wonderful. And the world is alive. And the consciousness of the web of life is fully self-conscious and fully alive. And we are as connected to the trees and the rocks and the rivers and the red kites and the ponies and the hill as we are to ourselves and each other. What the actual logistics look like, I have no idea, because we don't know what happens in a digital world when we're all also connected in digital ways as cleanly and clearly and with as full agency and heart as we are connected to the web of life. But I dearly want it to happen. So I don't know. It looks connected. It feels connected. I think I'm more inclined to understand what it feels like, and how it feels is that everybody wakes in the morning with that sense of confidence and safety and security and sheer magic, that being in love with the process of being alive. So that I have no idea what the day is going to hold, and I don't need to, because I have the trust that I am fully connected in that serotonin mesh of connection to all parts of myself, to all of my human community, and to all of my more than human community. And those communities can be of place, but they can also be of purpose and of passion, connected through the digital web that we are creating, so that I know what's mine to do in any given moment. And it might be not what was mine to do yesterday, and it probably won't be what was mine to do tomorrow. But I know here and now, here and now, I am talking to Amisha. I am giving it everything that my heart knows how to give, so that the result spreads out into the world in ways that I don't need to define. It's not, I don't have to know why. I just have to know what and how. And the how arises out of the what, and the what arises out of my connection to the web of life.
I really resonate with that. And I feel that more and more. I have absolutely no idea and can only go with that feeling of what feels aligned in the moment without any idea what it's contributing to anymore exactly.
Yeah. And that knowing the feeling between my ego wanting to push things and my heart mind being connected and it arising from there. I think for most of people in the weird world, Jonathan Haidt's phrase, Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic, where our disconnection defines our entire culture, feeling that connection to all parts of myself, to all of my communities of human and more than humans, so that I have a knowing of what is arising from that rather than the hopes and the fears of my head mind. And only in the brief time that you and I have connected here, it seems to me that you have that knowing. And I imagine most of the people listening to this podcast have that knowing. And how do we share that in a culture that has a tendency to define people by their consumption capacity? And I don't have the answer for that. I've been reading Bill Plotkin recently, in some ways quite problematic, but he has an interesting framing of the trauma culture. He doesn't call it that, but I'm fitting it into my framing of initiation culture versus trauma culture, which I took from Francis Weller. And Plotkin's concept is that there are 4 interconnected steps in the evolution of each human being. From infancy, childhood is one, adolescence is next, then adulthood, then elderhood. And that most of the global Northwestern weird culture is locked in the first stage of adolescence. Each of these 4 has 2 for him. And we can die never moving beyond the first stage of adolescence. And I watched the political shenanigans around the world. I watched the devastating horrors that humanity can inflict on ourselves, each other, and the more than human world. And it does seem as if there's a degree of growing up to do. And yet I meet people who feel to me fully realized human beings so often. How do we bring the understanding that this is a good thing and a useful thing and a possible thing out to a critical mass of people such that it becomes what we do? That's my big question for now. And I think that's an integral part of moving into this place where everybody is fully connected, fully realized, and fully acting from heart mind, not head mind.
There's something there that is the challenge, which is if somebody gets to that place in themselves, we're still in this culture and we're having this conversation just a couple of days before the US election. This will come out the day after, the day that the results are announced. And, talking to many friends and collaborators in the US and everywhere, because it affects everywhere so deeply, there's such a sense of grief and there's no winning. And, either way just feels like such an extraordinary compromise on just really general human values. And so I'm curious, how we balance that without going too far kind of out of the dominant culture so that we're not in it and we're not shaping it anymore. And then without getting swamped and sucked in to the machines of the dominant culture. So we lose that connection to the web of life and what's sending us in the first place.
Yeah, and that's a perpetual question. We swim in this sea. And we could go and live in a cave somewhere. My version of that is a straw bale hut on the west edge of Wales and be completely off grid and grow all our own food and endeavour to survive. And as you said, how much impact do we have on the world? I have a friend that I went through the regenerative economics masters with at Schumacher who ended up throwing himself off the top of a building. And he's still alive. He's paralyzed. He has no legs from the knees down. And yet he has moved from a place where he didn't want to live in this world because he didn't want to contribute to the damage of the dominant culture, to reframing that as not being prepared to live in this world and giving everything that he is to changing it. And I think that shift, the system is designed to perpetuate the system. The political systems that we have are not broken because they're working very well at perpetuating the system, but they're not fit for purpose. Understanding that and then letting that ripple through to pretty much everything that's in our culture is not fit for a future that we want to live in. It's not something that we would want to leave to the generations that come after us. And yet, how do we shift it when we're inside it? I think there are an increasing number of people for whom this is a really deep inquiry. And I always come back to the answer of settling into our heart mind. For me, the three pillars of the heart mind are gratitude, compassion, and joyful curiosity. And the joyful curiosity, that sense of, wow, this is amazing. I wonder what happens next. The not knowing. That leaf on the tree, wow, it's amazing. The ponies in the field, wow, they're amazing. The capacity to talk to you is amazing. I wonder what happens next. The not knowing is what allows the space for the web of life to send the knowing in. Our culture gives hegemony to head mind. We've spent thousands of years deciding that we were separate and that our heads knew best and that our hearts were at best a distraction and the realm of the feminine and could be ignored. And we're realizing this isn't true. Obviously, it's not true. But I think it still takes people who were socialized, domesticated in our culture. It can take a lot of time to step out of a place where knowing the answers is what we got reinforcement for. It was how we survived. It's how we make our way in the world. What happens if we don't do that? What happens if we don't know the answers? What happens if we just continually ask of the web of life, what do you want of me? And strive to hear the answers of that. Where does that take us? And for me, that's the avenue through. We live in a hyper-complex world. Our head minds are designed for complicated, not complex. We can think linearly, cause and effect, over a particular time frame. We're exceptionally bad. As soon as even we move to exponentials, Daniel Schwartzberger says the thing that's going to destroy our culture is our failure to understand exponential growth. We're not good at exponentials, and we're not good at multiple intersecting exponentials, which is where we are just now. And so we can either try and do something that we're actually very, very bad at, or we can let go and understand that the web of life is hypercomplex. If we are to take our place in it, because we are an integral part of that web of life, we take that place by asking it what it needs of us, not by telling it what we think it should need of us. And when we can do that, then how do I dismantle the system stops being my question. I recognize that the system is not fit for purpose. I recognize that any move to change it to a different system would be a good thing. I cannot predict what that new system is. I can be in the heart space that is the best that I know how to evoke in any given moment. And I can continually ask the question, and I can let go of the sense of responsibility of having to know where it's all going to go. Because that, frankly, is what got us to where we are. And it's not working. So let's do something different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that the name of your latest book is Any Human Power. And it feels like even that is such a powerful offering at a time that I feel like so many of us have kind of struggled or are tussling with, like, the notion of whether we are powerful or powerless, or like what it might be that, that we have to offer. And I think, especially if I think about my own journey of being kind of part of that wave in 20 years ago of, like, okay, like, sweatshops, and, like, do we know what we're doing to the environment, and, like, what, like, to kind of where we are now. And that there's, for me, like, I've had a real reckoning with that sense of, like, what I can change and what I can't change, and that incredible energy of youth, and also that mind power of, like, I can be the one that, like, helps make the
Yeah.
difference to, like, like, I don't know if anything I do matters. And of course, that's all part of the journey. And I feel like we constantly go through, like, little cycles of death and rebirth around that, finding ourselves, like, powerless, and then remembering the powerfulness that we have when we're connected to
Yeah.
the web of life, and like letting go of the big change to come to the little change to then get a burst back into the big change. It's like, there's this kind of constant dance that we get invited into. I love this notion that you offer of human power at a time where, sometimes I even just question, like, is it also okay that if humans have had their time and to like let something else emerge here? But here we are humans, and we are human centric in our experience of the world. And yeah, what does that mean to you, human power?
Oh, it means so many different things. And I think the first thing to do is to acknowledge Ursula Le Guin, because the phrase comes from a talk that she gave 10 years ago now. And the more complete version is, we live in capitalism. Its power seems unassailable, but then so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. And often the impetus to that resistance begins in art, often in our art, the art of words. She was talking to a group of publishers, and she was really trying to make a point that the publishing industry had been wholly captured by capitalism, and perhaps it would be good if it wasn't. But it's a very resonant phrase for me. We live in a world where somebody else, I can't remember who, said it's easier to imagine the extinction of all life on Earth than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And that remains true for a lot of people, and it should not. But partly it does because those of us who write, whose job is to be creative, whose job it is to imagine other ways of being, have not been doing it. And the realization of that, and the realization that I needed to stop writing historical novels thinking that if I showed who we were, people would suddenly realize who we could be. And that actually I needed to write the who we could be rather than expecting other people to do the work, was a huge shift in my own process. But I believe it to be true. Yes, we can get hooked up in I am powerless because I am one person in 8.5 billion people. Or we can consider the concept that the web of life is a hyper complex being of which we are an integral part, and each of us has something that we are there to do. I'm in the process of rereading James Lovelock's Novocene. So James Lovelock was the originator of the Gaia hypothesis. And Novocene postulates that Gaia, the consciousness of the world, stored as much sunlight as was possible and has released it in the fastest burst possible in order to enable its own consciousness to emerge into a new system. And I don't know that I necessarily take that on board, but I think it's a very, very interesting thought experiment. And either way, we are an integral part of the web of life. When I had the visions that started Accidental Gods, one of those was of the magical earth, the blue pearl of earth floating through the blackness of space, that image that we saw when the first moon landings took place. And all around the pearl of the earth were millions upon millions upon millions of very, very, very fine fibers of light crossing and crossing and crossing and crossing. And at every intersection was a node of consciousness. And some of those nodes were human and most of them were not. And it took me a long time to unpick the vision and work out what it was trying to tell me. But it's there now every morning when I do my morning ceremony. Every single one of us is a node in the overall consciousness. And creating the clarity between me, the parts of myself, my human community, and particularly the web of life, seems to me the single most important thing that any one of us can do. Making that channel a clear channel so that I can ask, what do you want of me? And the answers feel real and actionable. What else is our life for? The world is too complex for us to plan where it's going. And trying to do so is what ends up with inane things like geoengineering. So what happens if we don't do that? And the answer, I don't know the answer to what happens, but I know that it's possible to do it. And that if enough of us do it, we will reach a critical mass where that becomes the norm. And then the web of life is alive in a new way. And isn't that an interesting experiment to take part in?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you share what you do in your morning ceremony?
So I teach shamanic dreaming, which for me is contemporary shamanic practice. It's built around the wheel of being, of life, of the world, of the human consciousness, of the year. It's a wheel. But I think our culture is the only culture that works in straight lines. Every other culture there has ever been works in circles. And so if I'm going to work with the gods of the land, I want to work in circles. And so I face each of the directions, east, west, south, north. Then I come into the center, and then I face southeast, southwest, northwest, northeast. And I greet that which stands for me in that direction, the essence and the elements. And I thank it. I welcome it to the glory and the wonder of the world. I thank it for its gift to my life, and I invite it to share this day with me. As an integral part of that, when I get to the center for the second time, so there are 10 places. There's the 8 round, there's 4, the cardinal points, then the center, and then the marriage points, and then the center. So that's 10 altogether. When I get to the 10, which is for me, what connects the heights of the sky with the heart of the earth, and the heart of the earth with the heights of the sky. That also is the point where I really envision that web of life such that it feels alive and carries me through the day. It usually takes me about 4 hours on Friday night to teach that to the students, but that's it at the fastest possible. It's connecting to what matters to me and welcoming it and thanking it, really.
I mean, for me, ritual and ceremony is like the most precious and important language that I have, and makes everything possible.
Yes, and you've spoken a lot, I think, to Nina Simons, and she did the work with Oscar Maria Casada, who said, consciousness creates matter, language creates reality, ritual creates relationship. And for me, the combination of the 3, consciousness, language, and ritual, is what a morning ceremony or any ceremony is about. Really focusing my consciousness and having a language that feels rich and alive and evolves. And then the ritual of that brings me into alignment with all parts of myself, potentially with the communities of which I'm a part in the human and the more than human world. So yeah, I think it's amazing.
Do you feel like it's possible to connect to that, where the web of life is inviting you to move without a relationship with ritual and ceremony? Because for me, I feel like it's all come through that relationship.
No, fundamentally, no, I think you're right. It comes through. I imagine that if one were to engage in forms of meditation, it would be possible, but even a form of meditation becomes a ritual. In behavioral terms, you set up a set of cues that evoke a particular neurodynamic process that becomes repeatable. And that's a ritual in itself. Our lives are laden with rituals. Brushing our teeth is a ritual, if we let it be. The question is how much, where does a habit become a ritual? And it's a habit if we do it unconsciously, and it's a ritual if we do it fully consciously. So we're back to, how do we become fully conscious? How does the wish and desire to be fully conscious land with us in any given moment? Because it's possible to do a ritual in a way that's unconscious, or it's possible to brush your teeth in a way that's fully conscious. In my world, the fully consciousness really matters. And cultivating that sense of being fully conscious through the day is an integral part of what we're trying to do. And then that our whole day becomes a living ritual in its own right. And no, I don't see how you could possibly connect without that sense of being fully conscious in every moment.
And that is also what true meditation invites us into. And so for me, true meditation is a ceremony, different to kind of, sitting being like, I must not think any thoughts.
Yes, which is impossible anyway.
Yeah.
Yes, totally. Yes, absolutely. And so we could use that kind of the I shall not think any thoughts, and then I will tell myself what an amazing person I am, as basically spiritual bypassing, or we can just be open and connected as cleanly and clearly as we can. And it's hard. I'm not suggesting that it's straightforward or that it happens without effort. But I also think it's the thing that we do as human beings. I imagine other species are as fully conscious as we are. This idea that it's only humans is extraordinarily anthropocentric. but we can do it. And the world, for me, is a so much richer place. If I am fully in love with the process of being alive, I am that because I am fully conscious. And then because I am fully in love with the process of being alive, I become more conscious. And it becomes a really nice, self-reinforcing, positive feedback loop. But similarly, being unconscious can become its own feedback loop. So the forms of meditation that we tend to practice in the West are invitations to become conscious, I would say. But some of them are more practical than others.
The premise of any human power, like it starts with death. I'm allowed to say that, aren't I? Without
Yes,
giving too
it's not really a
much
spoiler. It's
away.
on the back cover. Yes.
Yeah, I would love to hear more around that vision and how that came to you as a starting place. Yeah, and then maybe we can go a little more into death.
Yes. So it arose as a result of a set of visions. The baseline is I'd written for 20 years, mostly historical novels, mostly endeavoring to explore how we got to where we are in ways that would give people a sense that the world is not necessarily the way we think it is. And the most recent novel was set in World War II for historical reasons we don't really need to go into, but partly because my American publishers had said Joan of who when I wrote the Joan of Arc novel beforehand. I thought, right, I'm going to write an era that you have actually heard of. Anyway, and it went to 17 drafts, and that's 17 times where I've handed it in thinking it's finished. And between drafts 8 and 9, I twice threw away the entire contemporary thread of a double-threaded novel and started again. It was extremely painful, and I did not enjoy a single moment of it. Well, that's not true. I enjoyed bits of it, but it wasn't fun. And I did quite a lot of like the last 5 or 6 drafts were while I was doing the Masters in Regenerative Economics at Schumacher, which was a completely life-changing experience. Partly I was in Devon, partly I was an integral part of a new community that was very self-consciously building itself into community and then taking itself down at the end of the year. And I was learning all the ideas of regenerative economics, and I'd gone as a result of a shamanic imperative. Economics was nowhere on my radar until that year, like not even remotely. I was a vet, and then I was writing history. Economics is an irrelevancy as far as I was concerned. But then I realized it wasn't. And so I came home with a sense of urgency that I hadn't had before, and a sense of understanding the extent to which a lot of the answers are already out there. We're just not knitting them together in a way that's coherent. We're trying to slot them into business as usual instead of accepting that this system is not fit for purpose. And look, here are the building blocks of a new system. And I started the podcast. I also started the Accidental Goals membership. My wife and I did. Partly because of the vision that I told you of the blue pearl in space and the web of life, and an instruction that came with it to start teaching at scale and trying to understand what that meant. And with the podcast, we're recording this on Monday. It's coming out on Thursday. It will not, we hope, be obsolete in the 4 days that takes. Writing a novel takes a long time, and then publishing it takes even longer. And it seemed to me that podcasting was a much cleaner, clearer way of getting things out into the world, over which I have agency, because I really did not enjoy the publishing process of that last novel. So I thought I'd stopped writing, basically. I would write blogs. That would be fine. And then summer solstice of 2021, so second lockdown of the pandemic, I was teaching online a course that I had always promised everybody. There was no chance at all we would do this online because it's too dangerous. We need to be in person, blah. And then it was 2 weeks quarantine either side for people to come from around the world. And so we ended up teaching online. And there's always everything. We do a kind of theory U for everything that I teach, where let go, let be, let come. And the let be is, generally speaking, the fulcrum around which the entire workshop turns. And I was drumming the journey for that. And I had a set of visions that were really plain text. And anyone listening, you, anyone else, mostly when I do the shamanic work, and I think when anyone does spiritual work, you ask the web of life, what do you need in me? And the answers come in felt senses and nudges and metaphors and things that it took me literally 18 months to unpick the meaning for the visions that I had that led to accidental gods. both the membership and the podcast. And actually, I'm still unpicking them, and that's 7 years on. This was totally plain text of I have a 30,000-year-old fossilized horse's tooth that holds the southern side of the southeast gate of my altar. Find some ethically sourced horsehide. That took me a month. Take it up the hill. I live on the side of a hill. I just turned the ponies out onto that hill. And this farm has been here for many hundreds of years, probably since the Doomsday Book, possibly before. And there's a very old laid hedge where the hawthorn trunks are 6-8 inches wide by now and parallel to the ground. Bind the tooth on at a particular place, sit with my small of my back against the tooth, looking then southwest down the valley in a particular frame of mind, and that was really crucial, for an hour as the sun goes down every day until further notice. So I did. As I said, it took me a month to get the tooth, because the thing about that is I've been at this game long enough now to know that if you get something in plain text, you absolutely listen to it. I absolutely listen to it. I'm not going to mess around asking why or what. I just do it, because plain text is plain text, and it's an instruction. And the relationship that I have with the gods and the guides and the web of life is, you give me instructions, I will follow them to the best of my ability. And it was gorgeous. It was, by the time I'd found the fossilized, the horse skin to bind it on, it took a month for that to turn up, get up there. And I was up for 9 days, 9 evenings, watching the crows go to bed. It was gorgeous. And on the 9th of those, the opening scene of this book and 3 scenes within it arose, and the instruction, first of all, now you have to write the book. You can come up the hill if you want. That's your choice, but you have to write the book. You don't have to sit up every hill. This is what you're here for. To write the book in a way that was grounded in a recognizable present and was opening doors towards a future that we would be proud to leave behind, was mapping a route through to capitalism not being the only thing we can imagine. Actually writing what I now would call a Thrutopia, but I didn't have the language for that then. And I also had to set up a course to teach other writers to do the same, because it needs not to be just me. There have to be multiple visions of how we can potentially get through it, multiple different ways of engaging people emotionally. And the first scene that I saw was of a woman in her 60s lying on a bed. Her grandson is at her side, and he says, "When you get home, can we go up the hill and watch the crows go to bed?" Which is what I'd been doing. And she says, "No, I'm not coming home. You know this. We've had this conversation. I'm dying. There is no coming home from this." And he's broken and devastated. And in the course of their ensuing conversation, he says, "You're the only one who gets me. I do not want to live in a world with you not in it." And she realizes that he's serious. And she says, "I don't know what's coming next." Which she should have an idea, because she's been an anthropologist for 40 years and her main focus has been on Indigenous views of the dying process. But anyway, when you actually get there, you realize you probably don't know very much. But if you really need me and you call, I will do whatever it takes to come to you. I'm not going to leave you, I promise. And she and he and we all feel the gods pause in their labours and fix that. That's a promise. You are now held to that. There is no getting out of it. And then she dies, and the whole of the rest of the novel is told from her perspective, locked in the between the lands of life and the lands of death, endeavouring to fulfil the promise that she has made. It's probably worth at this point, the other 3 things that I saw, that within the shamanic work that I do, there's a concept of the void as being a place where total annihilation happens. I am really quite invested in the concept that a part of us survives death and moves on, that death is a rite of passage, and Lan expresses that. However, the void is not a place in which to get lost, because everything gets lost, gone. And she's taken into the void by the crow that becomes her teacher very soon after her death. And she is shown how to evolve, how to focus her intent and split the timeline so that she sees many of the ways in which Finn, her grandson, does kill himself on the night of her death. But the implication of the void and of doing that splitting of the timelines is that if you can take that agency, then it may be possible, it's not guaranteed, but there's a potential that you can take agency to create a future that you haven't seen, one that does not exist yet, because you haven't taken the agency. So she's presented with that as potential, and then she's thrown back into the lands of life, consensus reality, with the invitation of, okay, you really care about this boy? What can you do? How do you take agency? And then she void walks twice more, once for the family and the extended movement, global movement that is arising around them, and then once for the whole of humanity, where she sees the bus go over the edge of the cliff in the metaphor. We're all locked in a bus, and the old white men have got their hands fixed on the wheel and their foot on the pedal, and they're driving us over the edge of a cliff. And she sees all the ways humanity can crash and burn and the horror of it. But the implication, again, in each of these cases is if you're there and you can see this, then if you can take agency, there may be an alternative future. And that's what I wanted was, if we can see this, how do we all take agency? And what does that alternative future, what are the building blocks? What's the actual logistics of changing the governance system, changing the economic system, changing the food and farming system, changing the entire system? What does it actually look like, and how do we get there? That's what I came down off the hill with. And then the question was, how do you do that? Which was not easy, but you're holding the book in your hand, so it was possible.
Thank you for listening. If you are enjoying this episode, please do get more involved. You can do this by joining our membership, Presence Collective, where we explore deeper how to create beauty in the mess. And you can find details of our experiences such as Reclaim Your Intuition, beautiful leadership mentoring, and our in-person retreats. By joining in and being an active member of this community, you support the making of this show, keeping the episodes full length, free and accessible for all, so we can stay advertising free in a world that is always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. Other ways that you can connect into the ecosystem is by sharing these episodes with those in your life and dropping us a note from time to time. Head to allthatweare.org to get involved. Before we go deeper into the book, I want to talk about receiving visions and being able to listen to your intuition on that level and then bring something through. Was there a time in your life where you deepened into that relationship to open the space for that to happen? Or do you sense that that's always been there as part of you, and with age and experience, you've got better at fully seeing and giving space to the visions when they come?
Both. So I've been practicing what we would now call contemporary shamanic work since the mid-80s. And before that, I was exploring druidic work. So from the point where I got to college, I was 16 when I went to university. And one of the things that I did was go off and start exploring. Suddenly I had agency. But I knew that I wanted to from long before that. I was a kid growing up in a little tiny village in the south of Scotland. There wasn't an awful lot to explore then. And then I went to vet school and the world opened up. Understanding both that this is a possibility and then how to listen, really listen and respond is an evolving process. And I'm in my early 60s now, and I don't imagine it's going to change between now and whenever I get to go on the next rite of passage. But the first time it was really, really clear, or the first really plain text thing, was before I started writing the Boudica books. I had been writing crime fiction, but even the incentive to write arose out of the practice. I just didn't understand, why am I writing crime fiction? I mean, I loved it and it was fun. It wasn't paying the bills and I was still being a vet, but it felt really important. And then there was another shamanic event. I don't think we have time, but I've described it in a blog somewhere that led to the Boudica books. And that was another really clear, plain text, no arguing, do this event. And that was spring 2000, summer 2000. So whatever that, 24 years ago. So it's always been there. And I've always been striving. I was 9 years old when I realized that other gods existed than the one that I was being given, that as far as I'm concerned is a psychopath, and that it was possible to connect with them. And that all I had to do was figure out how. And the whole of my life has been devoted to the figuring out how.
You spoke to how these intuitions have appeared in your life at different times. And, there's an aspect of it which of intuition, which is so like in the day, like the very small impulses. But then there are these like big visions, like you can date them. You're like the summer of 2000, that like that they're kind of unforgettable, life-changing moments where something spoke to you so strongly, and it just pulled you into something that made no sense to what you knew of yourself at that moment, like where it really is an initiation, where you're pulled by the web of life into a completely like unexplored aspect of yourself that then you discover is just so true to who you are and has always been there.
Yes. And you can't demand them, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's really important to say. I'm spending a lot of time asking, what do you want of me now? Another book? I have 3 potential sequels in my head. I've started a couple of them, but maybe not that. And I'm just following tiny, tiny felt sense nudges and waiting to see. And I think the not knowing and the still showing up in that heart open space of I am as connected as I know how to be, and I am in this moment doing what I believe is what's mine to do. Waiting to see if there's another shift like that is a really important thing. I think people have a tendency to wait for the big stuff, the bells and whistles and primary colors and kind of fireworks in the sky. And actually, it's the tiny, tiny incremental shifts are so important. And it might be that that's it for the rest of my life. It's tiny incremental shifts and there isn't another big plain text moment. And that is completely fine. And I remember after the Boudica books, I got to the end of those and I spent a lot of time sitting at a different hill, but on a hill with what do you want of me? What do I write next? And all I got was, you write whatever you want, doesn't matter. What mattered at that point was starting to teach the dreaming. And that's where my focus was. And I was getting a lot of help with that. But I spent months with, no, you have to tell me what to write. And they never did. I mean, not until now, really. They say, oh, write whatever you want. It's fine. Write what your publishers want. It'll be okay. And my publisher said, no, please. What do you want to write? And somebody has to tell me what to write. And in the end, I did write stuff that felt fun until Any Human Power came along. And then, okay, this now I need a lot of help with this, guys, because this is going to be really complicated. I have no idea how to make this happen. And I think really clearly, if I had not been running the podcast and talking to people every single week the previous 3 years, I would have had no idea how to write Any Human Power, not a clue, which is one of the reasons why we set up the Thrutopia Masterclass, because how do I expect my writing peers? I get very cross now with people who write stuff predicated on business as usual. Because really, if we who write can't create the ideas of other futures, who the heck is going to do it? And why would you not? But if you don't spend your entire life talking to people who are living at that emergent edge of into becoming, then you don't have the input. All you have is the stuff around you, which is how business as usual perpetuates itself. So the podcast was an integral part. And if I hadn't listened to the nudges to do the podcast, I would probably still be writing Any Human Power, going in circles with myself. So I think listening to the little nudges and doing the stuff that feels like this is mine to do now and I have no idea why is really, really important.
Yeah. I really feel like what the dominant culture like loves to do is to fill all of those little gaps, and all the space gets taken. And if we let it, and it's not even like you have to be such a ninja to like keep that little bit of your own space to hear all those little whispers, because otherwise our time, is being competed for at this moment, and by the machines of capitalism. And so being able to keep the space to hear the whispers, allowing ourselves to move with the whispers, even though they're not grand, we don't know where they're going, maybe they don't even fit with like the notion of who we think we are or what we think we're supposed to be here for. But it's just trusting that, like that little bit, like bit by bit. And I know that this theme of trust is really, really important for you.
Yep. Yes, totally.
And I mean, it is for all of us. And I also feel like in in the most recent years, as we're in this big time of purification, like my trust has been shaken so many times. I've experienced a lot of betrayal, which I also feel is a symptom of this time, that like as that fear kind of can rise and consume us, that it's kind of easy to be pulled out of that trust, and then that rooting into what you shared: gratitude, curious joy, and compassion. And I love that those three can kind of like anchor you back into trust.
Yes, totally. Yes, absolutely. And everything you touched on there, trust in the process is much more important than trust in outcomes that we have created, that are almost certainly not going to be there, because the trust in the outcomes that our head mind has created is going to be broken. Trust in the process is hard. You look around the world at some of the things that are happening just now, and it's incredibly hard. And yet I can still find, I live an incredibly privileged life. It would be considerably harder to have trust in the process if I just watched my entire village be washed away or bombed to obliteration. It's hard. And my feeling is I have to look at that and know that I am in a position of incredible privilege and give my absolute whole heart, 1,000%, to being crashingly grateful for where I am. Heart explodingly grateful, heart explodingly compassionate for everything that I connect with, and can maintain the joyful curiosity, because I could really easily fall into despair and despondency and all of the things that go with that. And that's not a valuable set of energy to push out into the world. So I think knowing that we have a choice in every moment of what is the energetic space that I fill is really important. And this is not a denial of the grief and the despair and the rage and everything that flows through. I can feel those while being heart explodingly in love with the process of being alive. And I think allowing that to be a thing, to have done the inner work so that the parts of me that are in despair or raging at the world are not taking over the core of who I am. They have their place, and I can honor them and let those feelings through, but I let those feelings through. And I remain grounded, and I remain connected, and I remain committed to offering my love and my compassion and my gratitude and my joyful curiosity to the world as the gifts in every moment. So I think it's easy to see that as a way of, if we frame it in old style thinking, then it becomes spiritual bypassing. And it really is important that we not do that. But it is also really important that we observe what we're offering to the world. And on an energetic basis, is back to Oscar Maria Casada and consciousness creates reality. The energetic emanations from each of us, I think, are probably our single most important presence in the world. And curating those in a way that is cleanly connected feels to me really, really important.
Yeah, I can really relate to that. I'm having an experience in my life, in my home, that like requires that of me, like every day, to be able to sit with the pain and the destruction of illness and the way that can come through, and where the system, is kind of obsolete, where we're paying £10,000 a month for care that doesn't even cover like what we actually need. And to be able to then be like grounded and rooted in love, and be able to allow grief to move through sadness, frustration, rage, but mostly love.
It's hard, and a constant practice, I would imagine.
Yeah, and it's also really beautiful. And like, it's beautiful because it's alive. And the worst bit is when it overwhelms to a space of like despondency. And that's when I'm like, I'm like, oh, okay. Like if it's really like in that pure rawness of the emotions, then I feel that aliveness. But it's when it goes into despondency that it's like, that's like the sense of defeatedness. And I feel like, I'm having this experience. We're all having experiences in different ways in these times that are offering us, in a way, like a rewiring and a way of inhabiting our bodies in a different way, and meeting the world in a different way, so that these visions that we speak of, these visions that we dream of, that we feel the possibility of, like, have the opportunity to really come and be part of this world. It can't happen without us profoundly changing who we are.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And then the only question becomes is, how is that change best facilitated? How can I facilitate that change without defining where I'm going? I think that's the point of emergence into a new system, is I don't know what it looks like, but I can predict a bit the emotional and energetic space that allows it to happen. What came up for me as you were speaking of the really difficult things that you're experiencing, two things was Sophie Banks' concept of micro return paths and of the community within ourselves and the communities. This is not Sophie Banks, this is me mapping it onto IFS work as much as anything. But we have communities within ourselves, and then we have the communities of place, purpose, and passion with the human and the more than human world. And it's finding the richness of those communities offers us a pathway within which a traumatic experience does not have to be traumatizing. One of the things that we are learning from Indigenous peoples and from people who live in initiation cultures that are whole and clean and clear, as opposed to our culture that has been living in trauma for probably in the West 10,000 years at least. So we have many generations of trauma. And that trauma is the separation from self and other, and the more than human world being part of the other. And so how do we get to a point where our traumas don't just stack and stack and stack and overflow and overwhelm? How do we, in a world where we don't have a functional initiation culture and the elders to hold us, how do we each and with each other, how do we build the communities of self-care and compassion that allow traumatic experiences not to be traumatizing? The good thing about that is there's a lot of people also really, really thinking about this and really working hard to work towards that in ways that change. There's a book, I can't remember the authors, but the title is something along the lines of, we've had therapy for 50 years and nothing has changed. And it's a perfectly accurate observation. And yet modern personal work, I think, is moving us into places of change. It's not just helping people to build stronger walls around the acceptable part of themselves to isolate out the bits that we don't like so we don't have to see them. We're beginning to work in ways that enlivens and creates stronger connections with the communities within ourselves, with each other, and with the more than human world. And it's not easy, and it's not going to get any easier, but it is profoundly enriching. And things can be hard and be enriching at the same time.
Yeah, I feel like if we let go of a notion that, like, you know, the good, the bad, the, like, if it feels good, like, you know, and just accept that a life has always felt all of those things. And, you know, when you talk to people from other generations that had less choice, like, there's more of a pragmatism of like, yeah, there's these things in life that are really hard, but you just deal with it and you move forward and you find the joy, like, within it. And I feel like because we're in this time of so much choice and the over kind of, you know, the notion that you can buy your way out of anything, it disconnects us from actually the truth of what the human experience is, which is that you really can't buy yourself out of, like, that real soul, like, experience of connection. You can go on hundreds of retreats, like, and like conferences and ceremonies, and go and connect with people that are like doing all of that. But actually, like, if you don't have that sense of community, like, within yourself, with the more than human world, and you don't have that sense of community around you, which is something that I feel like we're all struggling with, as that notion of community has been broken down in culture and society, then you're always going to feel that bit of disconnection and loneliness, and that your potential is not being realized, because our potential, it gets realized in relationship.
Yes, totally. And I think this is why we end up with people who go off and do ayahuasca and come back and their world doesn't change. Because the point of working with anything that helps us to see beyond the very narrow confines of consensus reality to the extraordinary multitude of all possibility beyond is that we do it in community. And we're in community with the plants, we're in community with the people. And if we take 2 weeks off work and go and do it and come back and step back into exactly the same frame that we started, it would be remarkable if the change lasted. And I think this is one of the things that we were discovering with the movement that started in the 80s of business people going away and doing really deep retreats and coming back and nothing changes. Business as usual is still completely annihilating the living web of life because the values on which it is predicated haven't shifted. And yet, if people really begin doing the inner work, then we don't need to go and do the ayahuasca. You don't need to go and sit in ceremony with exotic people. You do the work at home. And then things begin to evolve because who you are is shifting and your value set is shifting. And I think the value set, what is it that we really value? And if it's stuff, exactly as you said, you cannot buy your way out of there being great gaping holes inside. We are born as little forager hunters, expecting to come into a world where we are cherished, where we're part of a whole community of people who value us and each other and know their place in the world. And our culture doesn't offer that. When we look at the indigenous cultures, nobody's trying to buy their way out of anything. And nobody is defining the world as difficult. It's an enriching place. Even if it's hard, even if there's no food, it's enriching. And nobody goes out to do a job that they hate. The world is what it is because everybody is doing what's theirs to do. And they know what's theirs to do because they've evolved the knowing of that in a mesh of serotonin containment that enables that understanding. And it cannot be impossible for us to get back to that. We have 300,000 years of human evolution and 10,000 years in the West of being separate. And that gives us 290,000 years at least of being connected. I read a paper in, I think Nature, not very long ago, where somebody had looked, a team had looked back at our DNA, and between 800 and 900,000 years ago, our ancestors, there were 1,280 reproducing adults. And we are all the descendants of that. That's 900,000 years ago. And whoever we are a result of two of those who survived long enough to produce children, and their descendants survived long enough to produce children, who survived long enough to produce children, who survived long enough to produce children. And in the end, it produced us. For all of that time, that's 900,000 years, there was connection with ourselves, each other, and the web of life. And it's a very short time. It's the 10,000 years of disconnection. The reconnection is urgent. I think we've said that several times in this podcast, but it's also possible. It's our birthright. We are born knowing this. And it's however long we've lived, we only have to undo that amount of disconnecting.
When you share the numbers like that, it makes me feel like no wonder it hurts this much to be separated when we know in our bones that connection so well.
Yes. There's a really interesting book by Christopher Ryan called Civilized to Death, which is a kind of shorter version of what David Graeber and David Wengrow wrote in The Dawn of Everything. Both of them I totally recommend to people to read. But our culture is not natural or normal. If you give me a second, there's also a really interesting, it might take me too long to find it, but it's someone who's did his PhD on comparing the behavior of people within modern culture, Western culture, with zoo animals, and the fact that we all are showing the same neuropathologies as zoo animals within our current culture. And so how do we manage not to do that? Okay, Vaughan Wilkins, I'm just going to read you something from his PhD thesis. The collective developmental trauma that we experience points to a cage that is constructed through norms and conventions and a faulty definition of sanity that condones us living in a way that is killing our own life support system. by living in a way that is anti-ecological and hurting us, but then naming it sanity. We validate and condone it, and then teach it to our kids. It becomes a secret cage that prevents us from living as functioning members of the Earth community. And I've kept that because I think it's absolutely on point and quite devastating. And yet it offers that opening of, we don't have to be like this. This is not sane. The way that we live is not sane. The value system that's basically says who dies with the most toys wins is not sane. Constantly spending money on boxes from Amazon or rockets to Mars is never going to fill the hole inside that would be filled by genuine connection to ourselves, each other, and the more than human world. And understanding that is the key to our liberation.
Yeah, I really feel the connection with like the zoo and social media.
And the harvesting of our attention and the race to the bottom of the brainstem and the limbic hijack and the tribalism. That Jonathan Haidt did the work where he showed that if my tribe, whatever that is, political, all of the various ways that we're separated, my tribe appears to be losing and then begins to win, the dopamine rush that I get from that is as much as a nose full of cocaine. It's wholly addictive. And social media amplifies that. It doesn't have to. Audrey Tang created social media in Taiwan and is trying to create a citizen's buyout of TikTok to create WeTalk, to create a social medium that doesn't amplify the hysteria at the margins of the tribal wars, but instead amplifies people who build bridges across the divides. It is wholly possible to do that. It just needs not to be anchored in an economic system that requires growth for a very, financial growth for a small number of people. It requires to be anchored in a system that says we're going to do the best we can with the technology that we've got to create better humans, to enable us to become the best that we can be, instead of mining the worst of ourselves. It's totally possible. We just need a different value set.
I wonder, as you were writing Any Human Power and then like coming to the end of that and then releasing it into the world, and of course through any creative project and any writing project, you learn so much in the process. Like you couldn't have even imagined what you might write until you write it. What stands out in this moment for you as the ways that writing this book has fundamentally changed you and what's possible in the world, and I guess in relation to human value systems?
That's such a good question. So two things are coming up and they're both quite different. So the first is I really had to explore death in ways that I hadn't. I thought I did. I teach a course at the Sunday closest to Samhain every year called Dreaming Your Death Awake. My apprentice and I teach courses within the Dreaming Awake community, the shamanic community, about death. That writing an entire novel of 180,000 words from the perspective of someone who dies about 5,000 words in required a lot of reading and a lot of thinking and a lot of really just sitting with and asking, getting to know this Alana as an individual and asking for her process. In terms of my writing, this is the book that's had the most dreaming input and the most dreaming writing since the first of the Boudica books. So it feels very much like an inheritor of the process from which that arose. As soon as I knew how to do this, every morning I was asking for help because it's a really complicated set of things to do. Was writing the dreaming of this and then writing an actual route through, which route to something that allows us to see the possibility of a political change and financial change and business change and change in the structures of the system. And so that was the other thing. I had spent several years talking to people once a week on the podcast, but again, I had to really go into how would this work? How actually could we get a group of people together to change the governance system of the United Kingdom or any country within the boundaries of what's legal and peacefully. And predicating it on peace was one of the other things that came down the hill with, this has to be peaceful. It's not a new system. If we're going to lean into violence as an answer to our problems, because that's not emergence into a new system. That's just iterating the old system and the old system of the trauma culture. So understanding that and then weaving a path through and getting to know the people who could weave that path through and getting to feel the potential of it. And I got to the end of it. And even now, I seriously hoped that we would launch it and I'd have many months. I originally hoped a year before an election so that I could go around the country and be on podcasts like this and go, guys, this is possible. We can do this before the next election. This is what we do. And then we launched the book and they announced the election, like pretty much the same day. I had 5 weeks before the election came. It was very annoying. But then it gives us 5 years before the next election to look at the system is broken. Electing a different set of ties in the same suit, different tie is not the answer. And I'm guessing it must be obvious to anyone who cares at all that we're not changing anything significant. We are not even repainting the deck chairs on the Titanic. We're just moving a couple of them. And it's not going to make any difference. So how then, peacefully, and with a different value set, do we create the change that we need? And seeing a route through, having the idea that that's possible is quite different to actually mapping it out. And now I've mapped it out. I know it's possible and there will be other ways to map it out. And it's really encouraging. So I came away both much more entranced by the process of death and dying than I had been, and much more hopeful of our potential window for moving into a new system than I had been.
Are there any stories or more specific ideas that you can share of that how?
So I leaned a lot into Audrey Tang, who is, at the time of writing and at the point when the book was published, was the digital minister of Taiwan and the youngest digital minister on the planet. I think possibly the only digital minister on the planet, and definitely the only openly trans minister on the planet. And also, I would say, a genius. And one of the very few people who understands the imperative for social connectivity and can code for that. This is a genuinely transformative individual. And I read and listened to everything I could get my hands on about Audrey Tang. And about a month after the book came out, I got an email. She's collaborated in a book with Glenn Vile. And Glenn Vile sent me an email saying, we both read your book. We don't know how you did this unless you hacked our brains. Because I'd taken what they'd done and iterated it on a little bit further. And I was so happy. I can't tell you. Getting an endorsement for Audrey Tang, I could just retire now. I was skippily, dizzily happy. And what she's done is look at what is governance for, not what are governments for, because our current governments are designed to maintain a system that is broken. Or at least a system that's not fit for purpose. How can we make governance again into something that is generative and collaborative? How do we trust the people? We don't get trust unless we give trust. And again, listening and reading to the things that were done in Taiwan by way of asking civil servants what solutions to problems they would put forward rather than just telling them what you want them to do. And so they discovered they had someone who had been born in one of the little islands off Taiwan. And they discovered that if somebody got really sick there, they were probably going to die because they would need a helicopter to get them off. And it took a while to get a helicopter there. And if the helicopter didn't get there in time, then they were dead. And so within a very short time frame, they decided, okay, so superfast broadband is a human right. Everybody has it. We will make that happen. And once you've got that, we will train up the doctors on the islands such that, say, a surgeon in big city at the main island of Taiwan can connect with someone who's sufficiently competent and has the equipment on the island and talk them through the surgical procedure they need to do. So that the person never has to leave the island. Helicopters stop being part of the problem, people stop dying. And that's still within the business as usual frame. It's not changing the concept of human health and our approach to it in the way that I think that we need to do in the long term. But it's what happens when you actually start involving people in the governance process. And then if we take that a little bit further, we now have the technology. For instance, I spoke to someone on the podcast who is using quadratic voting on the blockchain within Finsbury Park to help people decide what artworks should be on the plinths in Finsbury Park. The first past the post system that we have for electing people is guaranteed to elect the wrong people. But we have a technological system now. We could use quadratic voting is interesting, and Glenn Vile, who collaborated in the book with Audrey Tang, developed quadratic voting. But it's a way of getting far more nuance and giving people the capacity to select from a wider range. And if you particularly, then you can extend quadratic voting over time such that a vote only counts for a certain amount of time. And you have to keep voting over a period of time to maintain the solidity of your vote, and you can spread your votes. Suppose we did the US election or the UK election, any national election, would then not be a binary question of the person who gets one more vote than all the others then gets to be part of a government that will probably take no notice of that individual and will make decisions based on the power structures that exist. You would start at parish level. You would do what, in fact, they're doing in Forest Row at the moment, where their parish council is 21 people big, which is huge. That's bigger than some town councils. And the parish council was elected at the last election. A group of independents stood and they said, we are not going to make decisions. We are going to implement the decisions made by a citizens' assembly, or actually probably a people's assembly. A citizens' assembly is created by sortition, and a people's assembly is people who volunteer. So people's assembly will get together, anyone can be on it. You will decide what this parish needs, and we, if we are elected, will try to work out how to do that. And here are the principles on which we will do that, make that decision making. And we will use sociocratic processes, and here's the sociocratic processes that we will use. And they got, I think, 19 seats out of 21. And so they're doing exactly that. Suppose we do that everywhere across the world. Each little governance body is there not to define what to do, but to define how best to do what the general people want to do. And at each level, the assembly and the governance body, all the deliberations are held openly on camera, and you can watch them on Zoom in real time, and they're recorded. And if you decide collectively that these people are not representing the views of the population, then you get to elect somebody else. And then that body, which is the smallest local body, gets to elect 2, 3, 4, 5, a number of people to go to the next body. So from village level to county level or town level. And again, all deliberations are held openly. And if you decide that any of those 5 people or all of them are not representing the views of your people, you get to recall them and send somebody new. And then each iteration of that, let's say there are 5 levels from parish to national governance, and then a 6th level to international governance. At every level, the deliberations are held in public. And if the people who are there are not representing the people who sent them, then they get to recall and they get to choose more people. And so eventually you get up to national governance level, where the national government is not there to decide what needs to happen. It's there to implement the decisions that have been made at each local level going up. And if you need decisions at a national level, then you decide who makes those decisions and the criteria on which they are made. And again, all decisions are made with full accountability. And if you had that, the world would change overnight. One other thing, that's at local governance level. One of the other ideas that I think would really take off is to use the future governance model of business. And this is, again, everything that I used in the book is being done somewhere. It's just that I pulled them all together in one place. There's a business, River Simple, in Wales, not far from where I live, that's making hydrogen fuel cell cars. And we could argue about that a whole other time. But their governance model, I would make 2 changes. Their governance model is that they do have shareholders. Shareholders have one place on a 6-member board. And the others are the workers, the customers, the supply chain, the local community, and the global environment. I would add future generations. And I would make all meetings sociocratic. But apart from that, I would go with that. If every business in the world moved to that tomorrow, because the board then defines what the company is for. And the company is not just to make money for shareholders. And at the moment, if you're in the US, you have a fiduciary duty to make money for your shareholders. It's what you're for. It doesn't matter what your sustainable development goals or greenwashing. That's irrelevant. It is greenwashing. Your job is to make money. And that's not a sustainable way forward. We need to change the basis on which we share and exchange value. And I think shifting to a future governance model would be a step on the way. But imagine working for a company where you know, first of all, that you've got a voice on the board and all meetings are held openly and you can recall your person if they're not representing you. And if you live locally, you've got another voice on the board because you've got the local community. And if you care about the world, you've got a third voice on the board because you've got the voice of the global ecology, the web of life. And if you care about future generations, you then have 4 voices on a 3-voice board. It's incredibly empowering. And your company, from the day that's set up, is beginning to look at things other than just making money. And if your company makes brown carbonated sugar water, for instance, not naming any of the companies that do that, it may be that by day 2, you've decided that that product is not something that you want to be putting out into the world. It makes people sick. We have 12-year-olds now having liver transplants, and their livers are in the same state that people used to see in long-term alcoholics. That's not a sustainable product. So what your company either winds down or it decides to make something different in a different way.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing these examples, because I feel like what's so interesting about your work is that it's not the, there is that kind of psycho-spiritual rooting there, but it also is about the how and like
The logistics.
and that we are as well, that these things all exist. They just need more of our power to them so that we can bring that into the world. And this lovely notion that you have of like Thrutopian, that we start where we are here with like a vision of where we can go, that isn't like a kind of utopia kind of, oh, and everything's going to be wonderful and the unicorns will be dancing with us, and and that isn't like, oh, like everything's going to shit, and that there's actually an empowerment that from here, from this very place that we are, something more beautiful is possible, and that we already have the ideas, the technology, the consciousness to create it, and we are creating it. We just need to tip it from being on the fringe into taking up more space.
Yes. And every podcast like this, every time anyone who listens to this begins to spread these ideas, it removes the power of the bigger narrative that only business as usual is possible and we have to keep maintaining it, because we know that's not true now. And yes, I really want to emphasize to people, the ideas are out there. There are really, really good people thinking really hard about this, and they are making these things happen. We just have to scale them up and make them the way things are done. And then other things will evolve. These are all stepping stones. They're not final endpoints. And we don't know exactly where the stepping stones are going. It's probably not ours to know, because there are younger generations coming up who also have ideas of their own. But in the meantime, we can change what's ours to change. And it's not hard.
Yeah. I love it. I got a new word that no one understands that I can put on my bio to make it even more confusing, because the heart of the work with all that we are. I've been doing this project since 2010, and so it has this long weave, but it started in an election year with a ballot box asking people to share the visions of the future that they want to create and the how we can create it, and like what's already creating it. And so that whole kind of notion, I'm now like, oh, great, I've been a Thrutopian.
Thrutopian, yes,
all this
yes,
time.
yes, there we go. And it is beginning, even that word. There's a publishing company in the US now that is soliciting Thrutopian novels because, and I quote directly, there's a movement arising in England. They don't know that the UK is not just England, but never mind, along those lines. So, just, yes, please, everybody start using Thrutopian, THRU, Topia. It's Rupert Reed's idea. He came up with the word, but he's quite happy with us all running with it. So yeah, go for it. And thank you for noticing that the novel I'm calling it mytho-political, because it's got the dreaming. It's deeply embedded in a spiritual reality and in endeavoring to create a new mythology, because I think in the West, our mythologies are rooted in the trauma culture. And what does it look like if it's not? But also it's political, because it has to be. I got an email quite early on from someone who said, this is too political. I thought, no, everything I've ever written has been political. The difference is this one has the word politics in it, and the others didn't. So yeah.
One of my favorite reviews for my book on intuition was somebody that said, I didn't buy this to read this woman's views on politics, so I threw it in the bin. Because there was one reference to systems of oppressions in the introduction and like how we had been separated from our intuitive intelligence.
And that was too much for someone.
It was too much for someone. And I was like, wow, that was so easy to offend, because actually that notion of changing the system, of like changing the dominant culture for so many is still so scary. And yet I feel that when somebody has a moment where they see it suddenly all differently, like that can never be undone.
Yes. And partly it's scary because there are not obvious options. And I think people internalize the idea that if we acknowledge the horror that our culture has created and the need for change and the separation from who we are, then retribution will be visited on them, and they don't want that. And the window is so narrow now that it takes everybody pulling together. And I'm not saying that retribution wouldn't be valid, but I don't know that it's the priority anymore. I think the priority is to find what is ours to do and do it in a way that's fully heart open. Because we could spin our wheels with a lot of all of the culture wars. So honestly, is this what we want to put our energy into? We're actually going over the edge of the cliff and we're screaming at each other about what color the seats in the bus are painted. And I just think that's not useful.
I feel like also when you take it down to that personal level, I found that like when I have tried to face like what's happened and like kind of, be witnessed by community in like this trauma that happened, and I tend to get more traumatized. But when I'm able to understand it as an initiation that has no answers and that's basically shit, because all of this behavior still exists within the world and we meet it and it hurts and it takes part of us and it destroys part of us, but it opens up a passage for us to be reborn into another aspect of ourselves, and that we can never be responsible for how anyone else understands anything, feels about anything. That's not our part. Like, but what we can do is make as much peace with our own lives as we can, in order to keep that connection that allows us to keep receiving those impulses and living with that love and aliveness that we are.
Yes. Thank you. I could not have put it better. Exactly that. Yes. We could take another hour on picking that one, I think. But yeah, I think we are where we are. And there's huge amounts of shame and guilt and horror if we look back at the things, particularly that the white Western culture has done in the world, and they are appalling and unforgivable. And actually the things that are happening today are appalling and unforgivable. This may be a slightly too esoteric, but possibly not for this podcast. It seems to me that my very first teacher said there are two emotions in the world, there's love and there's fear. And we could argue that because neurophysiology has moved on. But there are basically two energies we give out into the world. And one of them is the compassion, gratitude, and joyful curiosity of an open, full, generative, alive heart mind. And the other is the closeness of fear and horror and guilt and shame and all of the things that close us in and cut us off. And we're back to, we have a choice of whether we feed the horror or the compassion. And I think it really matters now which of these energetically. I think there's quite a fine balance. I have a sense that there's an aliveness to the things that are fed by each of these, that there is an aliveness to that which is fed by our gratitude and our compassion in every given moment. And there's an aliveness to that which is fed by our horror and our despair and our rage and our shame. I think choosing which of those we feed is quite important.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also feel like it can never be forced for us to fully like receive the initiation, that like sometimes we have to process the rage and the hurt and all of that in order to like come back genuinely to that place of love and compassion and curiosity. And that's something that we have to also be better at giving ourselves and each other space for, to know that for that to be genuine, it is an initiation. And the initiation only knows when the initiation's complete.
Yes. And I also think there's something in our trauma culture about that. I've been reading a lot in and of, and it's all secondhand, people in genuine initiation culture. So for instance, this is quite a tight example, but Vanessa Andreotti, who wrote the book Hospicing Modernity.
Yeah, she's been on the podcast.
Right. So she speaks of the point where she wanted to marry someone of Spanish descent. And her indigenous grandfather said, no, you can't. He won't know how to laugh and he'll get bitten by snakes. And he won't know how to laugh. If you talk to anyone who's spent any time in a genuine indigenous culture, they're not busy processing trauma. They laugh when they're happy and they laugh when they're sad and they laugh when they're grieving and they laugh when they're in joy. And it's not denial and it's not spiritual bypassing. It's an understanding of the richness of the world. And something about our trauma culture locks us in our trauma. And I think finding ways to navigate that so that the part of us that is trauma, that is experiencing the trauma, does not become the defining part of who we are, matters quite a lot. And the other thing that when I first read that in Vanessa's book, I thought, bitten by snakes, so he won't understand the forest. And then I read Right Story, Wrong Story by Tyson Young Caperta, which is, I didn't get on particularly well with Santop, but Right Story, Wrong Story has blown my world apart. And there's a point where he's describing the making of a dugout canoe. And the adults are busy doing stuff. And the children, he says, are playing on the north bank of the river in a bend, jumping in and out of the water because today it is safe, there are no crocodiles, and tomorrow it won't be. And he just leaves that and goes on. And about 100 pages later on, he says, we of the Right Story, the indigenous peoples, don't experience the Paleolithic fight and flight that you all talk of because we know where the predators are always. And that then made sense of Vanessa's grandfather, of he'll get bitten by a snake because he won't have that knowing. And actually they were able to. Her husband the man became her husband, and they decided that he was great and they taught him. And that in itself, he learned. We know where the predators are always. We are so connected with the web of life that we know where everything is at any given moment. And tomorrow there will be crocodiles at the north bend in the river. But today it is safe for the children to play. And how do we get to that? Playing our place, taking our place, playing our role, and getting to a point where it's not that trauma doesn't happen. We are human living in a world that is ever changing, but it is that it's not the heart energy that we give to the world at any given point.
What is the call to action that you would like to leave us with?
That, really, what we just said, do whatever it takes to come into, for me, the 3 pillars of the heart mind: gratitude, compassion, joyful curiosity. As many ways into that as there are people on the planet. I teach some of them. There's, people want to come and learn with me. There's on the website, on the Accidental Gods website, there's the most recent module is a module on the heart mind. But that, I think, is the single most important thing we can do, is to do the inner work, get into balance with the parts of ourselves, and then with each other and with the more than human world. Do what it takes to become as fully realized as you know how to be in every given moment. And learn how to ask, what do you want of me, of the web of life? And be prepared to respond to the answer flexibly and fluidly and with your whole self in real time. And it's possible. This is possible. We can do this.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Manda, for everything that you've shared and for this extraordinary time together.
Thank you for the invitation. This has been so inspiring and enlightening.
And how can we connect with you more? So your websites are mandascott.co.uk and
Accidental Gods, all one word, .life. And then the Thrutopia masterclass is still at Thrutopia, THRUtopia.life. I might run that again next year, but there's the recordings are there. But accidentalgods.life is probably where people would want to go for the teachings. And there is a monthly fee, but frankly, you can join for £1, download everything, and provided you cancel within a fortnight, it will cost you £1. That's fine.
I love how you're sharing the hack.
Yeah, just do it. I mean, that's there because we live in the economy we live in, and we still have bills to pay. And I'm incredibly grateful for the people who join and want to be part of that kind of broader community. But if you don't, the stuff is all still there. Just do it. So Accidental Gods, all one word, .life. And if you want to know about the books, then Manda Scott with no A at the beginning, MANDA Scott, SCOTT.co.uk is there too. They all kind of join up with each other, but you have to look a bit to find it.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a wonder.
Thank you for listening. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and it has sparked some inspiration and creativity in you. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, join our experiences, and discover so much more over on allthatweare.org. We give space to our guests to share their perspective without debating it or fact-checking, as this approach allows for deep, unedited conversations from the heart. We trust your discernment and wisdom to take what is useful and challenge what isn't in your own understanding. We offer spaces for discussion and integration in our membership community, which we would love for you to join. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast. And so it's made possible with you, our beautiful community. If you loved this and would like to connect more deeply with us, please join our membership, retreats, and experiences. Share the episode with your friends and do drop us a note from time to time. Please hit subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen so that others can find us. This podcast is made by an all-female global team. All That We Are celebrates all that we are already and the untapped potential that lives inside us. It invites the full power of the more than human world, nature, the unseen, our ancestors, and our future generations. It reminds us that we never exist in silos through borders, timelines, or polarity. That in each and every moment, all that we are is here.